But we will go, we've only got a few things to go. Item 8. Item 8.
Chair, I might lead off on this one and hand to Gavin on the legal issues. It replicates a fair bit of the legal advice in the previous item, just process-wise, so we won't traverse all over that again. I thought it just might be helpful for the committee to have a little bit of context around the regulation of GMOs, as it's something that I was responsible for a number of years with the Hazardous Substances in New Organisms Act. So just so everybody's clear, there has never been an approval for a commercial release of a genetically modified crop or plant in New Zealand, or for an animal for that matter. The only releases related to veterinary and human medicines. So at this point in time, there is no imminent threat of a GMO being released into New Zealand. I think it's notable that between 1998 and 1988 and 1998, when we had the first set of kind of regulatory approvals over this area, there were 43 field tests conducted on everything from potatoes, asparagus, kiwi fruit, maize, brassicas, peas, apples, tamarillos, goes on and on. And the DSIR back then and subsequent Crown Research Institutes, as well as some commercial providers, were very active in this field. In 1998, the Hazardous Substances New Organisms regulations came in, and since between then and 2010, there were 20 field tests approved, but there have been no further field tests approved in New Zealand since 2010. There are only 2 still going. One is the radiata pine trials up in Rotorua with Scion, and Ag Research has some genetically modified cows and sheep at Ruakura in near Hamilton, which is to say that the scientific activity in New Zealand relating to developing GMOs has nearly collapsed in the outside environment. There are still hundreds of uses of GMOs in laboratories around New Zealand every year, and I did a stint as the Acting Chief Executive of the Environmental Protection Authority, and I signed off approvals for creating and importing GMOs into containment on a weekly basis, and I was surprised to discover how much was going on in the laboratory. But the regulations have become very tough. So between in 1998, the regulations around containing field trials were greatly enhanced. So effectively, you couldn't have any pollen going anywhere, and you had to destroy the soil underneath, and it's all got too costly, and so the science communities backed away from that. Obviously, simultaneously, there's been an increase in consumer concern and interest around GMOs, and most of the commercial operators in the space don't see a viable path to taking GMOs into the food supply. That's certainly the view in New Zealand. Where this whole debate is going to get particularly interesting over the coming years is what constitutes a genetically modified organism. Some of the horticulturalists in this room will know that historically there's been a range of technologies used, including using things like heat and chemicals and radiation to induce mutations in plants in the laboratory to grow new varieties of fruit and vegetables, and those processes were mimicking what happens in nature. So mutations happen in organisms all the time, and those mutations give us our different characteristics and how plants and animals, of course, evolve. And what scientists did for a period is they did various techniques to try and make mutations happen and then select and breed from those. Then you went through this period with genetic modification where viruses and gene guns were used to insert bits of genetic material into organisms. They were pretty crude technologies, and most of what's grown internationally by way of Roundup ready products, etc., use those technologies which were developed mostly about 30 years ago. In contemporary science today, there are new scientific techniques which are commonly grouped under what's called gene editing techniques. And they can often very precisely turn on and off a single gene function so that a particular characteristic isn't expressed, or in the case of, say, a pine tree, its reproductive ability is just turned off. Now, those technologies have been advancing at precisely the same time. Our ability to map the genome of any given organism has dramatically increased through computational power of computers, essentially. So what you've got going on in science today is increasingly techniques which either mimic natural phenomena or are very, very close to some of those traditional breeding techniques. And there's been a great debate about where do you define a GMO. You ask most layperson in the street and they'll say, well, it's about putting foreign DNA from one species into another species. They tend not to think about switching on a gene or switching off a gene with more precise technology. So while there is huge consumer concern around GMOs, and there is undoubtedly brand premium value for some exporters and producers in being GM free, where a GMO starts and stops is going to be continually tested. Central government undertook a piece of policy work 2 years ago on this. It was going to propose some changes to how you define GMOs. I oversaw that work and went in discussions with the likes of Zespri and Fonterra. There was reluctance for New Zealand to take any sort of leadership position on this, given that some of our trading partners have yet to move. And the European Union is the one that everybody's looking at, because they've been looking at gene editing techniques for some years, and they've had legal advice and science reviews and what have you done, all of which have pointed to some of these techniques not being deemed GMO. But the political economy of this within the European Commission is such that they cannot make a decision, and they have been for 3 years now essentially in a stalemate at the European Parliament about whether or not to address this issue. So all I really wanted to do was to foreshadow for you in the context of this issue. Not only have we got all the issues that we raised in oil and gas around the need to procure evidence to support a plan change, and we'll have to justify that in law, and a good chance that it will be litigated, given that we have seen the other plan changes, including the Hastings District proposed plan change, appealed. Given that there's inevitability about that, there's a bunch of work to do there. There will be an ongoing conversation, if you like, around what constitutes GMOs, and you'll see more and more technologies come out of the science community that will challenge, if you like, our understanding of what is a GMO, and challenge markets and consumer acceptance around those issues. So that's just a bit of an inevitability.
Thank you, James. Any questions? Yes, Councillor.
It's kind of a question, but also a bit of a comment. What I read in reading this paper, Chair, through you, James, the indication I'm getting is that that could be done, but that's not budgeted in either our annual long-term plans. That the issue is contentious because the legal issues are still being nutted. Some of the legal issues are still being nutted out in Northland, Hastings, and Auckland. So we're perhaps better to wait the outcome of those court cases, which are going to perhaps better define that whole thing about what is a GMO and so on, so that the issue becomes less contentious in a legal sense. So in terms of a question, you haven't actually mentioned that in your recommendation, but that would be a reasonable avenue to take, is to wait the outcome of those cases, and then hopefully by then we may consider having to put something together in a long-term plan so we can actually cost it and make sure that we have the resources to do the role properly.
Through you, Chair, perfectly summarised by Councillor Bailey. That is the essence of our advice. If you wanted to add a recommendation that the council takes a watching brief on the situation and continues to monitor developments, more than happy with that. We are continuing to monitor those. Certainly the essence of our advice is that there is so much litigation going on in this space at the moment. All we would be doing is adding to it, and we'd be running the risk of burning a whole lot of resource in the face of a whole bunch of uncertainty. I do feel duty-bound to advise the committee that, as I understand it, this is the last word I've had from Wellington, and others may have better political readout on it, that the current government's proposed amendments to Section 360D of the Resource Management Act that would give the Minister the power to take away our ability to regulate in areas regulated under other legislation is still on the table. And I understand it, the Māori Party is continuing to have discussions with the government on that, but that hasn't been removed from the package at this point in time. So there is a distinct possibility that before the end of this year that legislation will clarify this and it will take away your ability to regulate in the space, which doesn't change our overall advice that to proceed with a plan change in any event with this legal uncertainty would be an imprudent use of resource.
Given that much of New Zealand's economy is based on, in terms of our produce, is based on this perception that we have a green culture, and the quality of our food is well above that of others. I think it's important that we do give ourselves that competitive advantage by pursuing this position, and even if it isn't sort of supported in statute, I think perpetuating the belief by overseas buyers that is part of our culture, I think it's good for our region. We were at the Taniwha Dragons conference, and lots of the Chinese big players in the food market, they were reiterating this message. So even though we may not be able to get it across the line, provided we say that's what we're doing, I think that's more important.
May I make a comment?
So he's leading by example here.
Following the example of the co-chair, I have no problem with the notion of I think you used the term watching brief on this. It seems if the specific issue of whether regional council has the authority to move in this area is in fact sitting before the Supreme Court in the case of the Northland situation, I don't see why we would feel we needed to get ahead of that or get in that line. So I think it's totally sensible to say we would be in wait and see mode. I'd be happier with a recommendation that included, though, a restatement that the reason we are in a watching brief mode is because we are predisposed to take a precautionary approach to this issue if the authority to do so is confirmed. And so if we could maybe work that into the final resolution here, I'd be happier.
James, just the recommendation just says that we are receiving the legal advice associated with, so it doesn't make a statement about GMOs, period. It just says we're receiving the legal advice, really.
Well, to be slightly bureaucratic, our good neutral public servant advice to you would be that before making a decision as to whether or not you felt that GMOs should be regulated or prohibited in any way, that you would necessarily undergo the types of analysis that is required under the law to consider whether or not the pros and the cons weigh, and you've consulted the community and you've undertaken your Section 32 analysis also around alternative approaches of achieving your objectives. So process-wise, we would say that, that under the RMA, that's what's required of you. However, there's nothing stopping you making a political statement that's outside of the RMA process about the I guess the views of this council. So we haven't put that forward, and I don't see that necessarily as our role to do that. So it's very much over to you to craft your.
But notwithstanding what you've just said, the recommendation is just to accept the legal view.
Correct.
Chairman, we didn't ask for the legal advice on the theory that we were engaged in a theoretical academic exercise. Wouldn't it be nice to know? if we could regulate GMOs, the motivation for doing this was a concern about the introduction of these into our region, onto our land. And so that's why we have gone to the trouble of getting the opinion that we did get. So I don't see anything wrong with us sort of reaffirming that that's the direction that we were headed in.
If someone to move that we accept this recommendation?
Mr. Chairman. Sorry, can I suggest that we do that, but also that we have item 2, that the matter be kept under consideration awaiting the outcome of court and legislative decisions.
Is that an amendment to?
No,
So-
that's an addition.
Well, is Alan moving it first with that as
With that
addition
as an-
yeah, yeah.
yes.
That your motion is.
I don't, okay, have we have a mover for that? Do we have a seconder for that? Second?
I'm ready to second that. We can amend it if you want.
Then, do you want to talk to the amendment? Do you want to talk to the
Well,
additional?
Chairman, it just makes it clear that the matter has not been dismissed. It's there and it lies for watching brief, and that the issue would come back to the table for debate when there's some legal and legislative framework that we're able to either work within or not work within.
Councillor Barker, do you want to comment? I do want to comment. I don't support that amendment because I think that we made a very strong statement that we were going to support Hastings' position on GMOs, endorse Toro's previous comments. Our exporters, almost to a man in the horticulture sector, are saying that they're getting huge competitive advantage by taking this stance in the market. It's certainly in the Western market, but that's where we get our premiums. If you regard China as the Western market, certainly I endorse Toro's comments there that Chinese definitely are moving into the safe food sector and they're seeing GMOs as a risk. I think I would go further. We should be giving at least spiritual support to Northland, that this issue is much wider than just GMOs. It's about our right as a region to make decisions on these important things and not be dictated to by central government. So I'm really happy to accept the legal advice, but I don't want to move from our kaupapa where we were.
So
We're against GMOs in Hawke's Bay.
Are we against that?
Well, you're watering it down. It's a water down.
may I suggest to the mover and seconder some alternative language?
Sure, away you go.
That the RPC indicates its intention to explore a precautionary approach to GMO introduction in Hawke's Bay if the Supreme Court confirms regional council authority to take action.
Can I, we want to see if that's acceptable for the
Well, I couldn't hear it properly.
That RPC indicate its intention to explore a precautionary approach to GMO introduction in Hawke's Bay if the Supreme Court confirms regional council authority to take action.
What about if the Supreme Court, how about the legislative aspect?
Then what's the concern?
legislative section 3360D.
I'd be happy to accept that. Which does not mean I necessarily agree with the basic proposition. Yeah. just one concern about that wording, Chair. I understand, and maybe James can clarify this, is that the Northland action isn't actually up at the Supreme Court at the moment. It's still with the Court of Appeal.
This memo says it's been taken to the Supreme Court.
My understanding is that the High Court has made a decision and New Zealand Federated Farmers have to go through due legal process to seek leave to end up in the Supreme Court. They haven't quite got the nod of approval to appear in the Supreme Court just yet. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that's fine.
But that would be the final resolving of yes or no. Do regional authorities have the?
Hey, look, let's just cut to the chase.
So I think the mover
he has
accepted my
accepted
language.
that.
Did the
So,
did the seconder,
off you go, mate.
I'm happy to accept the change. I don't think all it does is change the stance, rather than watch and wait for the thing without making a statement about what our attitude would be. Tom's just added an attitude, and I'm happy with that. Always like attitude.
We have, so you've accepted as the seconder, we have a mover and a seconder. Any more conversation on this? Then it's item 2. Do you want to,
I haven't got it completely. I've got that the RBC indicates its intention to explore.
a precautionary approach to GMO introduction in Hawke's Bay if the Supreme Court confirms regional council authority to take action.
okay, we have a mover and a seconder. All those in favour of 1 and 2? Aye. Against? Carried. We're going to move along, get item 9 done. So we have